Legumes are flowering cover crops that produce nitrogen through a process called nitrogen fixation. They make nitrogen out of thin air, but it's not magic, it's biology, and it makes them very helpful in a vegetable garden. I'm Kevin Allison with the Marion County's Soil and Water Conservation District in Indiana. This work is supported by the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, North Central SARE, and Clean Water Indiana. There's lots of ways to garden, but let's take a close look at a no-dig approach to using fall-planted, overwintering legumes to prepare the garden for next year's nitrogen-loving crops. Here's an overview of the recipe I use. In summary, I plant a legume cover crop in the fall, such as crimson clover or hairy vetch. Allow the cover crop to overwinter and grow into spring, and before planting next year's crop, terminate the cover crop by cutting, mowing, or weed whacking, tarping, and/or mulching up. As the legume decomposes, it releases nitrogen from its plant matter and roots, which can be utilized by the next crop. Apply any needed supplemental fertilizer, broad fork if the soil is compact, and then plant the vegetable crop. I often use this strategy before crops that like higher amounts of nitrogen to grow, such as sweet corn or kale. Now let's step through those details. In the fall, I plant a legume cover crop and add oats for biodiversity. The oats winter kill or terminate in an Indiana winter, and the legumes survive to grow into spring and produce more and more nitrogen as they progress towards their flowering stage. Legumes also pair well with cereal rye, a vigorous overwintering grass, but for the purposes of the strategies in this video, we are leaving out the bulky cereal rye to allow for quicker termination of tender, nitrogen-rich legumes in the spring. My favorite mixes are crimson clover and oats, hairy vetch and oats, or a combination of the three. For legumes, the seeds should be inoculated with the proper bacteria to encourage nitrogen production. Either buy pre-inoculated seed or apply inoculant directly to the seed before planting. Ensure the inoculant product is compatible with the specific legume species you are trying to plant. The nitrogen-fixing bacteria live in nodules on their legume roots, where the bacteria convert nitrogen gas from the air into a form of nitrogen the plant can uptake for its growth. When the legume is terminated or decomposes, the stored nitrogen is released, and the nitrogen enriches the soil and the next crop. A pink center inside the nodule indicates active nitrogen production. Be sure to check it out in the spring before terminating. For seeding rates, I suggest using a high rate of legumes and a low rate of oats. The Indiana Cover Crop Seeding Table and a Seeding Methods document at marionswcd.org/soilhealth under cover crops will help you get the amount of seed you need for your area in ounces per square feet and some tips on how to plant it. In general, keep oats and radishes to low rates so as to not outcompete and smother the legumes. I do, however, increase the seeding rate of oats to normal or high if I'm planting later in the seeding window. More oats may germinate, but they won't have time to grow as thick as those planted earlier. If the oats do get too thick in the fall, you can try giving the oats a haircut to let the legumes come through, but it's helpful just to get the rates right from the start. In terms of cover crop planting timing, a good resource is the Indiana Cover Crop Seeding Windows, which shows common cover crop species and their best planting windows. In central Indiana, I plant crimson clover from mid-August to late September. Expect some fall growth, a pause in winter, and then spring growth as it pushes towards flower. Crimson clover often flowers in mid-April to mid-May the following year in Indiana. Hairy vetch is often planted in mid-August to early October. It often flowers in mid-May to early June. On occasion, a legume that is expected to overwinter can winter kill in colder winters. Winter hardy varieties can be helpful. If they die, try to keep your soil covered in other ways, such as adding mulch. Most years, the oats winter kill and the legumes survive. In the spring, my goal is to terminate the cover crop and then plant vegetables. As the legume grows further into spring, there's more roots, more time for building soil health, and more nitrogen production as the legume progresses towards flower. Not to mention beneficial insects they attract. The flowering stage is an optimal time to cut, mow, or weed whack to terminate a legume. Ensure the stems are severed just above the soil surface for best success. When it is in bloom, it is focusing its energy on reproduction instead of regrowth, and dies more easily when cut. I leave the nitrogen-rich, plant vegetation on the soil surface, and then plant vegetables by making spaces in the mulch and planting. Dead legume mulch is often very tender and can be moved around easily, especially when thoroughly weed whacked into smaller pieces to break up the legume vines. I then make spaces for transplants or planting strips for a row of vegetable seeds. FYI, for those gardeners pushing row seeders to plant, most models won't easily cut through dead legume vegetation unless it is chopped up very well, further decomposed, or raked aside. Legume vegetation decomposes rather quickly due to its low carbon to nitrogen ratio. To maintain 100% soil cover for soil health and to further suppress weeds, I'll often add compost, leaf mulch, or straw on top of the cut legume, as long as it's compatible with the crop. So the cut at flower approach with some added mulch for continued weed suppression can work very well with vegetables, such as blooming crimson clover cut before a crop is planted in May. But I also use legumes before some earlier crops, such as kale planted in mid-April, which could benefit from some nitrogen. So if I'm using a legume, I might need to terminate it before it has a chance to bloom. A legume can regrow if it is cut before flowering, which I don't often want when planting vegetables, so I take extra measures to ensure the cover crop's termination. In fact, when I cut the legume at the flowering stage, I still consider these tips to ensure full termination of the cover crop and any weeds before planting a crop. Remember to continuously scout for weeds and remove them before they set seed. Here's my favorite methods for terminating legumes, sometimes used in combination. One method is to repeatedly cut the legume until its energy is exhausted. Cut, let it regrow, and cut again. This isn't my go-to method very often because it is a bit unpredictable in how many cuttings it might take, or if certain weeds will survive it, but it can work. Another method is to cut the legume down and mulch up thickly to suppress any regrowth and future weeds. If cutting the legume early, a light mulch might not stop the legume's regrowth, so thicker mulch can be beneficial. Though not always necessary, a layer of newspaper under the straw or compost mulch can help block light and stop the legume regrowth and weeds. After mulching, waiting approximately 10 days before transplanting allows mulch to block light before opening transplanting spaces. Recent demos show same-day planting can also succeed, though there's an increased chance for cover crop regrowth around the transplants. More often than not, mulching up promotes great weed suppression and moisture retention. Lastly, one of the most effective ways to terminate legume cover crops in the garden is to weed whack and then tarp for approximately 2 to 3 weeks. The tarp duration can vary, so keep tarping until fully terminated. The tarp is removed, and the dead legume mulch can be managed to best complement how the next crop is planted, whether it be making spaces or rows for transplants or seeds. In this case, the legume residue was moved aside from a planting row, and seeds were planted with a dibbler or soil knife. I like to remember that the residue contains nitrogen, so I try to keep it close to the crops, but I will move it aside if it makes planting easier. The tarp sets back weeds very well, in my experience. However, the legume mulch decomposes fairly quickly, and I like to keep my soil 100% covered for soil health and continued weed suppression, so I'm inclined to still add some mulch, be it compost or straw, on top of the dead legume. This sweet corn received a light layer of compost mulch as it complemented the planting by seed, or a thicker mulch for a transplanted kale. In this particular bed, legumes were terminated by tarping before planting onions in mid-April. The legumes were very small at the time, so I don't expect much nitrogen contribution. I usually use a winter-killed oats and field peas mix before onions and early crops, but I wanted to experiment with legumes, and I like the idea of a root overwintering to encourage spring microbiology. I weed whacked, tarped, untarped, added fertility according to a soil test, planted onion sets, and mulched up with an inch of leaf compost. And they did great. So how much nitrogen is the legume providing? Be cognizant that results may vary by region and per a host of variables. But as this graph shows, the longer the legume grows into the spring, the more nitrogen it provides. 100% legume stand terminated when the flower is budding may contribute 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre, or 1.8 pounds per 1,000 square feet. While vegetative samples can be analyzed for better estimations, this graph provides a good working baseline for estimating the available nitrogen. If the university recommendation for sweet corn is, let's say, 2.75 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. A nitrogen credit of 1.8 pounds from the legume accounts for almost half of the crop's nitrogen demand, and amount of fertilizer inputs can be decreased. This graph shows that the majority of nitrogen is located in the above ground vegetation of the legume and is mostly released during the first 4 weeks after termination. Just something to keep in mind while managing cover crop mulch. Legumes can be very handy in a no-till garden. When it comes to sweet corn, brassicas, and even tomatoes, legume cover crops are a great way to set the bed up for success. Here's a quick review of timing. In the fall, after vegetable harvest, plant a legume cover crop. Allow it to grow into spring, and before planting the crop, terminate the legume by cutting and mulching up, or by cutting and tarping as discussed. Then plant the crop. There's tons of ways to use cover crops. This is just one, but I hope it helps. Thanks for listening.